All right, welcome back to our continuing discussion of CSS. This time we'll discuss the cascade part of cascading style sheets. So our reference, as always, comes from NDM, the Mozilla Developer Network. Search for Cascade Inheritance, and you can follow that link. So the cascade. A given element in HTML might be targeted by multiple CSS rule sets. And these CSS rule sets can come from multiple sources, both internal and external. And so you can have multiple internal sources. We've seen, for example, CSS, an internal CSS rule sheet within a single element in the header section of our HTML. But in truth, those can be sprinkled throughout in the body as well. So these little fragments of style sheets can be sprinkled, and I've seen it in commercial HTML files. And so there's multiple, you have not only multiple sources, but multiple ways to get those sources. So multiple source tags within the HTML files, and then you can include multiple CSS files as well. So the cascade means the rules accumulate through all those sources. So as the browser goes through and pulls in those CSS, it parses it and cascades the rules down. So different properties of a given element, let's say the paragraph tag, in one rule set you could define the font weight, and in another rule set you could define the text color. That's all fine. It accumulates those as it cascades through. And then you can also attach through different parts of a tag as well, through an attribute, through the state, through the class and the IDs. So not only multiple sources, but multiple ways to target CSS, and most of the time it cascades through and accumulates those things. Now, what to do in the next consideration, and that is when there's conflicting rules. So as HTML and CSS is parsed, the browser accumulates CSS in a cascade, and it must resolve those conflicts. In general, the browser considers source order. So if a style sheet is close to the element, then that's what gets applied, and that's the rule that wins. So if you have the SRC, or pardon me, a tag with a style attribute, that's the closest. Right? There's no getting closer than that, and so that would be the source order, specifically that. Okay. If it has an internal style sheet right above the tag element, that's also very close to the element. So simple order as it evaluates the CSS. Stronger than source order, though, is specificity. So an attribute of a particular element is more specific than the element itself. For example, if you have a class paragraph, but a rule, but it also calls out a class, so a paragraph with this class. If that is in conflict with just simply a paragraph selector, the paragraph plus the class selector would win, even if the class selector comes first in source order. That's about specificity. Now, specificity can get pretty complicated, not in terms of understanding it, but in terms of all the details that are involved, because an attribute of a particular element is more specific than an element itself. But then within that element can have multiple attributes. Which one is the most specific? So I'm going to show an example of this, but to get really in the weeds, you can look up the specificity formulas. You can research to get more details about that. But I think in general, you need to just consider source order first, and then stronger than source order is specificity, and that's, I think, what most CSS developers need to know. And for a specific case, you can get really into the details of specificity, but not necessary for our purposes. Okay, so next I'll show examples.